Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Today's book brings to bear on some of the most powerful and helpful macro trends rippling through society today. The book teaches readers how to harness their outrage and capitalize on global trends to instigate and encourage change across the world. The author identifies 5 global undercurrents with outsized importance that are shaping our world. The book's lessons are supported throughout with stories, experiences, data, and observations from across the globe. It is perfect for activists and leaders of all kinds who aim to increase their impact on their organizations and the world at large, as well as those who are intellectually curious who hope to increase their understanding of the changing world around them. It's a great pleasure to welcome author of Undercurrents, Channeling Outrage to Spark Practical Activism, Steve Davis. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. And good news for our audience, I have the book here behind me. I have a copy of this beautiful book up for grabs. Just sign up to the innovationshow.io newsletter and you will be in with a chance to win that copy. Steve, I thought we would start with your backstory, how you opened the book, in fact, indeed, where a new book of your life began, the refugee camp. I thought this was fascinating. A refugee camp sprawling across a large patch of jungle in Thailand. And here you say, born and raised in small town Montana, educated at an Ivy League university, you were open to new experiences, but wildly naive and about human suffering across the globe. Not to mention nuanced notions of justice, dignity, and grace. So you find yourself in a territory where you were ill-equipped to navigate, but this gave you new lenses through which to observe the world. I'd love if you started here, Steve.
Thanks, Aidan, for again having me and also letting me tell a bit of my story, but also talk about the trends in global activism that we're living with every day and I'm working with. So yeah, I was I'm American, obviously, was somewhat lucky in the sense that I was born in and raised in a very small ranching community in rural Montana, and ended up in an Ivy League school. I went to Princeton undergraduate and then got a scholarship to go or fellowship to go teach and work in Asia. And along the way, took some time, as the classic young adventure and bought cheap bus tickets and found some friends. And we kind of adventured all over Southeast Asia, including visiting a friend in a refugee camp at the time. And this was in northern Thailand. It was in the early 80s, 1980, and where the remnants of the Southeast Asia War were still very alive. A lot of refugees and a lot of work to support people that had fled the killing fields of Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos. And I went there with some anticipation that what was this going to be like? And, how did we end up here? But the thing that happened that I write about is I kind of in an awkward sort of, what do you do here? We were visiting a friend of a friend. I ended up not only observing a lot of the processes of refugees applying for refugee status and watching how all that happened and getting a real insight into, there's sort of this random set of processes in the world that actually end up adjudicating whether someone can, to change, pursue their ambitions or not in terms of finding new homes. And I also had a kind of fun soccer game where I just kind of did a pickup soccer game with some of the kids in the camp. And, I did that with that kind of arrogance of an American coming in thinking, okay, I'm so lucky. And these kids have been victims of such a horrible situation, which was true. But, in talking to them, they were confident, they were inspired, they were inspiring, and they actually didn't see themselves as victims, but saw themselves as my equal. And it really was a moment to remind myself and start learning the thoughts about, okay, how does the globe work? What do I need to do to be supportive of people in the world that have faced injustice or have faced, horrible discrimination or humanitarian issues, but also do it in a way that is not patriarchal or not presumptive of my privilege, but also recognizing their agency and their courage and their ability to forge their own future, and that shaped my whole career. That experience.
This was the moment that your approach to activism took root. So it started to blossom, and it blossomed into the beautiful approach that you call practical activism. I'd love you to explain what that was.
Maybe tying it back to the story a little bit is sort of watching a lot of the behind the scenes business of supporting this humanitarian crisis and helping these refugees resettle, which I ended up, frankly, doing for the next decade of my life or so, very involved in refugee issues and human rights issues and refugee resettlement. But what I observed there, that it, while there were sort of the highly visible champions of refugee rights, or the large, kind of Live Aid programs to support humanitarian crises, that a lot of the work of supporting, helping, and providing solutions is kind of the modest, invisible, and what I end up calling practical work of activism. So one of the things that I have observed over the last 40 years of being involved in a lot of social activism and a lot of issues is that we have oriented a lot towards celebrity activism. And that's good. They bring attention to an issue. They usually bring money to an issue. And so we celebrate, the celebrity philanthropists, the celebrity social entrepreneurs, and they are doing great things, or the people that are making a lot of voice in the streets, which again, I say in the book is super important as part of our the advocacy for social change. But what I observed there, and I've observed ever since, is that actually a lot of the real work lies in this sort of incremental business of slogging through social change, building teams, getting legislation passed, building capacity to support people. So I think that we need to start focusing more on what I call practical activists or practical activism, and giving more people the courage to get involved, even in small incremental ways, using skills they have or they might use in their day job toward social issues. And so I'm a big advocate of everybody has a role to play, and everybody can play a role, and it doesn't have to be, your life work, and it doesn't have to be highly visible, and it doesn't have to be highly kind of breakthrough innovation. It can just take some small steps, and we can keep changing the world.
I love the way, Steve, you explain it and you describe it, and building from the community up and teaching a man to fish rather than fishing for them. And I thought that was a lovely way to think about what we talk about on the show a lot, which is innovation and change management within organizations. It's the same thing. It's giving people the tools to do it for themselves rather than bringing in the consultants and telling them how it's done, that they build that own capability. And I just wanted to plant that seed for those listeners who are listening to the show to hear it through those ears as well. But let's shift to the magnificent title. I love the title Undercurrents, which you tell us refers to the deep and mighty tides invisible to a person navigating on the surface of an ocean. Undercurrents do not always flow in the same direction as the waves on top. Indeed, sometimes these underwater channels can pull us backwards, but often they surge forwards, propelling the way the water drifts, or landscapes form, or social changes move. I loved what you said there. But what about undercurrents in the context of the book itself?
I struggled with the title a bit because what I was really trying to get to, or what are these big mega trends in social activism that we should be aware of, and I decided that to kind of use a larger water metaphor, and so landed on undercurrents, which I've actually really enjoyed working within for the last year. Let me back up a bit on sort of why I wrote the book, and then that will explain a bit why I chose Undercurrents. Is I've been doing a lot of things, running a very large NGO. I teach at Stanford in the social innovation work. I've been involved in lots of social activism and corporate activism. I'm very involved in business and society issues too. And I've noticed over the last several years this sort of growing despair that, there's so much not working well in the world and so many issues. and people are beginning to be more paralyzed and outraged. And of course, part of it was written during the Trump years in the United States, but it was broader than that. The outrage and the, but people were like thinking that their approach to the outrage was either cynicism or negative, being negative, or you like something on Facebook, which isn't really helping much. So I started thinking about that problem and recognizing that on the one hand, I could feel it and see it myself. But on the other hand, when I sort of looked at the facts and the data and the literature, that there's actually a lot of very positive trends that are happening in the world that we're either not paying attention to or have somehow got lost in the narrative. The fact that we've reduced child mortality and morbidity over the last 40 years by half in the world, or that fact is most people are living better than they did 10 years ago. And this set of trends, and that well documented, has sort of, we've lost the reality. And there's some great books on it. Factfulness and some others are really establishing that set of data. But I thought, well, okay, so there are these underlying trends that are pretty powerful, and they are actually pulling us forward in a positive way. But we might, and for people to feel more confident, to get out of their paralysis and to channel their outrage, maybe they could be kind of riding one of these waves, if you will, and jumping on those. I've done that a few times in my own life, riding some waves. And so of social change that I've been a part of, but then that's actually propelled me forward. So I felt like describing some of these trends that I've seen or observed or studied would be maybe a useful way for people to build more optimism and build more confidence. So the undercurrents became the sort of the metaphor, starting with my childhood role as the irrigator on our ranch and working with water, all the way to today, where I still see these undercurrents playing out, even in the context of the trends we've seen beneath the COVID-19 crisis in the last year.
Before we go into those undercurrents and what they are, Steve, I think it's important to highlight that you are no Pollyanna at all. You've seen from the coalface how difficult this is, and there is real cause for outrage, you say. And the obstacles we face, whether confronting growing race-based disparities, economic inequality, political corruption, or climate change, are enormous. But your aim here is to help turn the frustration into optimism and ideally practical activism. Again, this is rooted in your own history. As a gay man, you say the journey of coming out is never over, and you've spent much of your time channeling that early shame into personal, political, and community transformation. I think that's really important because you have the scar tissue of experience, and this work and these thoughts have come from there.
Thanks, Aidan. And yeah, I build, first of all, build the metaphor a bit around some of the undercurrents of my own personal life, and that journey, sort of setting up the idea, including the last 40 years, riding the wave or the current around the gay rights and gay activism and being active. I was also an early participant in the digital revolution and have been sort of engaged in that. I was an early person going to China way back in the 70s, and currently run the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's China office. So you can see that I've been writing that. Amazing change in the world, complicated and very politically charged, but nonetheless amazing. So those are the trends that I've actually been writing myself, or observing and engaging with myself, and so that actually gave me more sort of confidence about, okay, what are the emerging trends for the next generation? But they are trends that are not based in, like that you shouldn't be. I'm not making the argument at all that you shouldn't be outraged, or that they're not real serious, complicated issues that some may even be existential if we're not smart. But hopefully, the collective wisdom, the collective energy, practical acts will help us mitigate their damage and continue this trend of the world getting, over time, with some back and forth over time, the arc of moral, it tends toward positive. The great Martin Luther King line I quote in the book, which is, the arc of the moral universe is long, and bends in the right direction.
You mentioned China there, Steve. You spent a lot of time over in China, and China's kind of got a bad rap in the West recently, and we tend to think of those countries as some way backward because of the way they used to be. They were underdeveloped. But you highlight about China. China is within reach of eliminating chronic poverty from its population of 1.5 billion people after fighting some 30 million cases of malaria and facing down more than 30,000 deaths each year. Through the mid-20th century, China is now on the verge of becoming declared malaria-free by the WHO. Who can ignore that type of progress, you say? We need to pay attention to that type of progress. This is good news throughout the world. But what can we learn from a country that has brought more people into the middle class faster than any other in human history? I think there's lessons in there, and I'd love if you'd share your thoughts.
This is something I spend a lot of my time on currently, is how do we continue to work and collaborate with partners in China, whether that's, academic partners, NGOs, companies, governments, and how do we learn from China as well as help support China's own development efforts. Even since I wrote those words in that book, this year, China in 2021, China will be actually declared malaria-free by WHO in the next month. And now it's a little bit complicated, but President Xi of China has declared that their poverty alleviation program is fundamentally over because, the sort of people they haven't moved enough people out of dire poverty. Now, it's a little tricky, that one, because it all depends on your definition and it's highly political, but nonetheless, so you can sort of go down that rat hole of what do they really mean, and are they being honest? But on the other hand, the bottom line is that there's been an enormous progress around combating acute poverty in China, and so I wouldn't say I'm certainly not Pollyannish, and I actually would even say I'm a very cautious optimist about China and in the world development today. We have, but I do think that we ignore China at our peril in any kind of work around development or global issues. I mean, we can't ignore China. It's will eventually be the largest economy by gross GDP, not GDP per capita, but probably by the end of this decade. Its innovation capabilities are immense. Its political commitments to other parts of the world are immense, as are ours, as are people in the UK or Ireland or the US. So I keep trying to figure out how we support China's efforts in a collaborative manner, but also not being. I've been trained as a human rights lawyer. My first publication was on the death penalty in China, so I'm certainly not taking this from a view that they're not serious issues that have to also be addressed in any of these conversations. But I'm actually think COVID will have despite the very complex discussions about the origins, will be eventually kind of a turning point, I think, in how we see China engage in the world, but also how China recognizes its own engagement within the bilateral and multilateral community.
As we'll find out, COVID has been an accelerant for many of these undercurrents that you talked about. So let's dive into those undercurrents. You say each of the undercurrents discussed in the book represents a macro trend that you believe is vigorous, intractable, and generally positive for our collective pursuit of improving the world. So let's dive in and, excuse the pun, diving into the undercurrent. The first one is pyramid to diamond. I love the concept of this, the mental model this produces, but also the great stories you share here.
This one, I think, is one of these wildly important but often misunderstood phenomena that's going on in the world that is really built on demography. And this is the idea that when we have established over the last several decades a metaphor around the socioeconomic structure of the world, that it's a pyramid, and you know, with a very small number of people living, their socioeconomic status usually measured in income or wealth, or living at the top of that, as a small band at the top, and then the bulk of the world is very much stuck in the bottom of the pyramid. And so we talk about bottom of the pyramid, base of the pyramid programs all the time. And that's been the way it's truly reflected in the way the world's been structured. But what's been dynamic in the last 10 to 15 years is the number of people that were moving from the bottom of that pyramid in acute poverty. And again, China has a lot to do with this, with the big numbers, but also India, Nigeria, Ethiopia, a lot of other parts of the world. People have been moving into the middle class at an enormous rate, as defined by World Bank and other standards. So in fact, today, the bulk of the people in the world live in the demographic middle of that sort of structure. And it now looks more like a pyramid, where there's sort of, I say a squatty pyramid, because there's still more at the bottom than the top. But it is really fewer people living at the very, very bottom. And so when you think about the pyramid, it has a whole bunch of implications. One is that it's a trend that will keep continuing, even though I think in COVID we've seen a setback. There's, you know, emerging data that we're going to pop back from that over time, and that may not be as disruptive, but it's certainly a notable issue. But this is a probably intractable trend going forward. Two, what it means is that so many people are now not living in complete dire poverty that they're becoming part of what is a low income but consumer class. And so this gives you more opportunity in the world of development and health to think about commercial, you know, high volume, low cost commercial opportunities for entrepreneurs and businesses to engage in the development work, and for development people like myself to engage in companies to help support that, which is a great thing. I think that it's incapable, giving even more capability for people to move from beneficiaries of aid to actually consumers of products and services that support their well-being. What it also means, though, is the distinction between the top and the bottom have gotten quite acute. So in fact, in this current diamond, the top of the diamond has gotten almost this tiny little spike that goes way up because it's so few people have so much wealth. I'm not focused on that as much, although that's a huge problem in the world. I'm also focused on the fact that at the bottom, we have fewer people at the very bottom, and they're usually, you know, in difficult situations coming out of conflict or humanitarian crisis or static poverty conditions. But what is interesting is those people at the very bottom today are often living in middle income countries. So I think that means, and I guess this is sort of the ultimate kind of the bottom line of this chapter, is that that we need to think about less about a global health and development and global development architecture built around countries and poor countries, which is the way it was architected really in the post-war, post-colonial period of the late 20th century, to really focusing on communities in different countries. And some of those are communities in countries even like our own in Europe and the United States, where I think that really shifts the conversation, and it's an important trend that's very positive. I mean, this is all means that we're finding momentum. The economic growth in and of itself is providing momentum to pull people out of dire poverty and bad health, but we now have to reorient ourselves toward local communities, toward more business solutions, and toward continuing to help people come up that ladder.
One of the things you mentioned, Steve, and something I found really interesting for our audience, is for those of our listeners in leadership roles or innovation or change or social innovation roles, you have a very diverse experience in many, many different companies. You worked in social innovation for McKinsey, you worked in leadership roles in corporate organizations, etc. And I thought it'd be great to share something for those of our listeners who are in such roles. Because you've spent much of your career in the for-profit world, running a tech company and serving on the boards of several multinational corporations. So you know well what you call the tug-of-war discussions between an emphasis on profit and the simultaneous interest in social impact between shareholders and any other kind of stakeholder. I thought that was really interesting and something I'd love that we could dive into a little bit more.
It's a huge topic, Aidan, and I appreciate that your listeners are keenly interested in this, and because I think this gets into this changing thinking about the role of business in society writ large, and the logical and inevitable tensions that we'll have to continue to wrestle with. I think there's frankly a lot of naivete about how business should behave in society, given their mandate and their I mean, I've run businesses, they're not easy to run, and keeping that engine working with to ensure that there's enough at the bottom line to make this sustainable is a critical and difficult thing for a lot of companies. But what I've observed is, I'd say two things. One is that I think in an increasing understanding, and I think we're seeing more evidence and literature on this, is that most of the biggest challenges in the world that we have to solve, either at the global level or at the national level or at the regional or local level, are not going to be solved by one sector alone. And I think about the public sector, government, the private sector, business of all types, and the social sector, which is philanthropic institutions, nonprofits, academic research institutions. All three of those are going to be important to be engaged. So the punchline of the overall book is we've got to be working on these multi-sectoral partnerships more and more. And I think more and more businesses of all types are being willing to engage and participate in those. But I think the real work of social innovation over the next decade is going to be managing, enabling, putting together these complex partnerships, and they're not easy to manage. But that's one of the things. The second is I do think that there is more possibility than probably ever before for corporate activism. And, that's a word that scares a lot of people. I've written about this lately, that, corporate activism, people get nervous. It's an unhappy shareholder. It's it's somebody protesting within the company or out on the street in front of the company. And I don't mean in those ways, although there's nothing, again, I don't have any criticism of that kind of activism. But what I'm saying is, there's more and more requirement for businesses of all types to, as a license to do business in their community or their country, to have some piece of the social agenda as part of there's more, corporate social responsibility requirements in many parts of the world. There's more understanding of what's called, increasingly stakeholder capitalism, that there are multiple stakeholders. So I think there's a very right moment for this that is part of this first pyramid to diamond trim, but is for more and more engagement, somewhat driven by the next generation of employees, somewhat driven by the social agenda. We've certainly seen it here in the United States, driven around the racial inequity issues and COVID, the sort of requirements of business to get hands-on on some of these emerging social issues in ways that we haven't seen before. So that's I think a very positive step, and I think there's ways that people can find employees or of companies can find ways more now than ever, whether it's supporting some philanthropic effort, using their role or skills at work to do certain things in the community, or just being a voice for their company. I think there are more and more opportunities for social activists in corporations in the future.
One of the things I found so fascinating about the book was, if you think about the work and the places you worked, the work that you've done, a lot of those countries had to leapfrog technologies because they didn't have the infrastructure to do that. So they may have jumped straight to mobile, for example, mobile payments, whatever it might be, mobile lending. And I think there's huge lessons for established organizations in that, because if they look to those places that have leapfrogged their technology infrastructures, they can actually look to the future, but they can also change their own mindsets about how business can be done. And I love the examples you give throughout the book. The book is peppered with fantastic examples. One of them you talk about, and a great example of growing markets at the bottom of the pyramid, very evident in brilliant programs such as Africa's 1 Acre Fund, which offers $80 a bundle of services, including quality seeds, fertilizer, tutorials on modern agriculture techniques, and training on market fluctuations to small farmers on credit. I thought that was brilliant, because this is truly the spirit of enabling those people, giving them the capabilities to grow their own marketplaces. And then we're actually making money from that as well, but less, albeit, but also changing the world as a result.
One Acre Fund is a great example. There are many like it, honestly, of more of these sort of entrepreneurial efforts that are figuring out packages of services or packages of products that are appropriate for those markets, affordable, often with sort of aggregated demand and other tools to get there. I mean, one of the fun things I get to do every year is as I mentioned, I have taught in social innovation curriculum at Stanford. And in fact, I just finished my last week and for the year. And the number of ideas being percolated and generated around very much designing products and services for low resource communities, but with a view that they will be sustainable from a business perspective, because they will generate enough return to keep reinvesting in the product and service, which is critical. And addressing all sorts of issues, from ways to reach kids who have less access to education, to addressing simple problems that we don't think about often, but everything from getting better toilets around the world, or working on in some parts, to and making that a sustainable business, to designing products to address in COVID, mental health in communities that don't have access to mental health clinicians. I'm quite excited by that innovation, and we're really seeing it start to scale up. So I think that's actually important as well.
You've made me jump ahead here, because you made me remember a great innovation that came, and where you were the enabler, your team were the enabler of this innovation, where it was using the condoms filled with water to stem bleeding. This was a fascinating story and a great case study in how you can harness the power of the crowd to build a very useful and meaningful product.
This gets really down, and I know you've covered before, but this whole idea of human-centered design and how we need to spend more time in cracking some of these big problems. Now, watching and listening to focus and really focus where the innovation comes from the communities that need it, because more often than not, in my experience, and having spent a lot of time in rural Africa and rural Asia and in really dire communities of need, that someone has solved the problem but unfortunately in kind of an unsustainable or inadequate way, because they didn't have the resources or the tool to really make it work, but they figured it out. A wonderful story I always tell, in addition to the sort of the condom project, or this was actually called a uterine balloon tamponade, and it's really to prevent bleeding after birth, which is still a very few people in the rich countries die of that, but in poor countries it's still a high reason for maternal mortality. And observing how nurses and midwives jerry-rigged with a condom a way to do that, and so we created a more sustainable, hygienic, very low-cost product manufactured in Africa, in South Africa, but for making that solution more accessible, but also, frankly, a better product, because it also was while it was designed with the community and the midwives in mind, we also brought gynecologists and others in to help us make sure it was designed correctly. Another story, and it actually is also interestingly, it was a township, a very, very poor township in South Africa. But remember, we were in a very, very poor hospital, and this very crusty old nurse was running the hospital, and she was no nonsense, and she was and they have a high level of maternal and child mortality in this hospital. Often the women weren't getting to the clinic in time, etc. They were observing all these challenges in this clinic, and yet so she was showing me the logbook when I was visiting, and the logbook had, this government issued logbook, which is pretty much, still in writing, handwriting. But it was, here's just 3 or 4 factoids about each patient. So you could see what she had done is drawn about 8 or 10 more lines by herself and was filling out more data on each of these women. And I said, well, why did you do that? She said, well, this is important information for me to know, but the government doesn't really care. So we usually don't record it. And so I said, well, why doesn't we help you take that idea to the government? And because she was actually innovating the data needs around taking care of women in this poor community that the government wasn't addressing. And so, long story short is her own innovation we could help translate into, frankly, over time, a change. And so all the government logbooks and now hopefully digitally and contain a lot more categories for data to manage services better. So I think, it's just a constant reminder of where innovation really comes from and how we need to listen to it and observe it, but also then think about how can we scale that up, or how can we make it more effective or efficient using some additional resources.
And you've set me up beautifully here. It's not in sequence of the undercurrents, but you mentioned here that project, and that is moving to digital disruption and embracing digital disruption. And you say data and digital tools will continue to bring valuable new capabilities to our world, revolutionizing everything from healthcare to education to conservation. And I love the brilliant example you give of the disease tracking nerve center in the DRC. I'd love if you had told us about this.
To your point, one of the 5 big undercurrents is that I include that I hope give people more optimism and opportunity for engaging in community activism is the digital revolution itself. And some people are like, well, why would you, this, like, it's been going on there's nothing new about it. Why are you mentioning it? It seems like kind of a duh. And I said, well, for 2 reasons. Number one, I think it's kind of a hidden current sometimes that's incredibly powerful, again, in this undercurrent idea. But also, the social sector has been a little slow to get the memo, honestly. I mean, so we need to put more energy there. And I think there's also a tendency in the social sector to talk a lot about the negative issues in the digital revolution, and there are. I mean, concerns about privacy, concerns about the digital divide, so my work is a lot now on how do we support addressing those. I co-chair the World Health Organization's Digital Health Technical Advisory Group. So, how do we actually address some of these policy and inequity issues? But my bottom line is net, it's incredibly positive trend, and we've got to learn how to mitigate some of these challenges. And I've seen it up front in communities around the world. So we do the organization PATH, which I used to run, and it's a large global health innovation group, NGO. But we've done a lot of work in very poor, very chronically corrupt. It's a very difficult country to work in, and a lot of political challenges, but in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Central Africa. And in the DRC, which is where the source of several of these outbreak diseases, not, specifically Ebola recently, have come from. So we helped, with the support of the US government and others, set up an emergency operations center. And, it's kind of rudimentary compared to what you would see in the CDC in Atlanta or something, but it was nonetheless a kind of a nerve, to your point, a nerve center for getting data from around the country so we can start tracking and tracing, outbreaks and responses. And so being there and watching how much, the big trick there is the measurement of success is from the time we observe an outbreak to the time from the time we think an outbreak started to the time we're able to actually observe it and do something about it. We've reduced that time quite a bit in many communities. Now, there's exceptions. COVID complicates the story, but to know, that a cholera outbreak is occurring faster is the real trick to addressing that problem. And these nerve centers are effectively doing that. So and so that's just one example of many, many, many of the power of digital and data transformation on global health and development.
And there's some great examples in the book, Steve. And I'm going to come back now in trying to get back into the chronological order communities are the customer. I love this because you share here, what does it mean to be community centered? Because many of our listeners work in organizational change, as I said, and I believe there are so many similarities here to community centered change. In the book, you give a brilliant example once again, that of PEPFAR.
This was frankly the hardest chapter to write because I think it's going to be the hardest. I think it's happening. I think it is an actual megatrend that's very much happening, but it's going to come. The actual changes that it is provoking will be hard to deliver. So what I mean is, we have it gets back to what I was saying earlier, that we developed a lot of the social sector, and particularly the global health and development sector, but it's true in other areas as well, around the kind of a post-colonial, post-war world where, there were the winners and the losers, but there was also the haves and the have-nots, pretty much divided by the global north and global south at the time, words I don't usually use now, and so a lot of the interventions were very much outside in. We needed somebody to come in and help here, come in and design, and they were being developed and designed in places like Washington and London and Geneva and Beijing, and not in the communities that they were trying to serve. And they saved a lot of lives, and they did a lot of good things. So I'm not criticizing that effort. What I'm saying is, now in most of those communities, with the exception of acute humanitarian crises, natural disasters, there are not that many fragile states, and there's more and more real capacity in communities around the world to with agency now to address their own problems, to create their own solutions, to innovate their own problems. And so that tilt from being sort of outside in to inside out is a very big opportunity. It's gonna come with some challenges, but it's a big opportunity that I think is one of these trends that I hope social activists for tomorrow will ride. And so I use the PEPFAR example again without any criticism of the enormous impact it's had, which is the U.S. Presidential effort for AIDS relief, which came out of the George W. Bush administration and is seen as one of the most successful in terms of sheer impact. And it kind of was timed interestingly well with the advent of ARVs. So it happens kind of at the right time, but it's very much driven, micromanaged out of Washington, D.C. And and I've worked on it with PEPFAR and PEPFAR programs around the world, and seeing how often tone deaf it is to the local communities, the local needs, and the local agency. And I think my own view is that those kind of programs, while maybe there's an efficiency, and there's certainly, what really matters for them is there's more accountability to the U.S., government stakeholder, but they're going to be deemed as less and less efficient over time. That communities are going to want to develop and support their own solutions. So I've taken kind of a corporate McKinsey tone to this chapter, which is, when we talk about who are our customers in business, and how value is created at the customer level, we've got to obsess on our customers, et cetera. In the social sector, I started advocating this idea that our customers are the community, and community can be defined broadly. It could be at a country level or the community level, but rather than our customers are our donors, our customers are our investors. That's not how business thinks of customers. It's the community, and interestingly, it's not necessarily the individual child or mother beneficiary. That a lot of the work we do for systemic reasons needs to be addressed at a community level. And so I think that pivot is really exciting. It means more and more engagement, more and more energy and ideas, entrepreneurism, and I see it every day from communities around the world, and more programs are more effective if they're designed that way. But it also means that existing structures are going to have to change. And so large government programs, philanthropies, really are rethinking how they have to operate. There's a whole movement about the decolonization of global health and development. That's part of this trend. There's a, much more around human-centered and community-centered design, as we were just talking about. That's part of this trend. So I think it's an exciting trend, but it has a lot to do with money and power. So it's going to be hard to see it realized.
That's a fascinating one for me. Reading your work, I was like going, this guy has so much experience in the corporate world and in social innovation and in community work. Yet, when you brought new ideas to some of those established organizations, they were often rejected. In particular, your concept of country as customer. I was flabbergasted by that, and it will mean so much to our audience who are change makers within their own organization to understand that when you're rejected for a new idea, it's perfectly natural. It happens to everyone. It happens to the best of us, and it happens in the biggest organizations, even the most advanced ones. I'd love if you'd give us your 10 cents on this.
There's a lot of good work on failing forward, and I think coming out of the tech community, where I spent quite a bit of time, I think we see that and we embrace disruption. We embrace, generally incremental, knowing that, 1 out of 10 things fail, sort of thing. That's harder as you get into big, well-funded organizations, and so I think we're gonna, have to. And I'm not saying anything new here at all, but have to figure out how to not to be accountable. I think people get this mixed up with accountability towards fiscal accountability or accountable for outcomes, but at the same time understanding that we're doing in the social sector particularly, we're often addressing things that have been unaddressable because of market failure or government or policy failure. So we're already tackling often these large things that businesses and governments have failed to be able to do it on their own. So we're going to have to take more risk, and with more risk means more failure, and then learn from that failure. And I think the real trick is learning from the failure and not lowering your standards. So failure becomes a norm in its own sake, but failure becomes a piece of like a performance indicator of your risk taking and your innovation. But it is true. I didn't really talk about this in this book, but I've written about it before. Is that it's a muscle you have to learn to build, and maybe I'm using the wrong body part, because more it's thicker skin that you have to develop around, that rejection is just part of this game, and whether you're pitching ideas, whether you're looking for money, whether you're competing for products. I mean, it is it's definitely the big social change is not for wimps. You gotta, and I remembered, I have a quote in my other office, but where it's that you don't see, you want to be liked and you want to be respected in order to build alliances and to create partnerships and to make the case for change. I mean, I do a lot of lobbying in governments around the world, and you got to go in and know how to play that game and appeal. But ultimately, a lot of the biggest social change does not happen because you made a lot of, you make quite a few enemies to make a lot of change happen, or not enemies, but you make a lot of people uncomfortable. And I think that's one of the things change makers have to keep reminding themselves, that it's okay if you've made people uncomfortable.
Brilliant, Steve. That'll mean a lot to so many people listening to the show. We've 2 more undercurrents, and I'd love to get through even at a top level. One, which will surprise so many, is that, surprise so many men in the Western world, because they think we're seeing more and more equity. But that's not the case at all. And I'll tee you up beautifully here with this wonderful quote by Winnie Byanyima, but I butchered her name, by Winnie Byanyima, who said, without women's equal access to positions of decision-making power and a clear process to get there, gender equality, global security, and peace will never be realized. You remind us that imbalances between the status of women and men stretch well beyond health indicators in poor countries. The World Economic Forum projects that globally it will take 99 years to achieve parity between the genders in political representation, workplace opportunities, and access to education. Women are 40% more likely to suffer severe injuries in car crashes, likely to because seat belts, and airbags are designed primarily by men, though it's hard to say for sure because no one has bothered to ever research why. I thought that spoke absolute volumes, and perhaps you'll give us your comments on this because you see this across the world, all over, Western world, Eastern world, everywhere.
Thanks. And yeah, the third trend I talk about, which again, I think is one of those kind of on the surface, everybody sees it, but the larger undercurrent that's powering change is one I think deserves a lot more focus and attention, is what I talk about is the role of equity in community and social development and social activism. And obviously it's another one of these tricky ones because a lot of social activism is built around equity, like, whether it's civil rights work we've done around, like the work I was doing on gay rights or other things. But I do think we've reached a different moment again, where we're actually having a very conscious set of conversations, not just in, kind of privileged institutions in the global north, but around the world about what it means to truly develop equity as a principle. And so social activism will, I think, forever more be filtered through the lens of equity. And that's gender equity is what I wrote mainly about, but I think it also gets into racial equity, tribal issues. There's a variety of dimensions of this. And it goes without saying, many people, a lot smarter than I am, have been writing a lot about why and how this is coming about. Will it be sustainable, et cetera? But even in sort of social activism and community development, we have gone through a decade of issues, whether it's some of the challenges that the Charity Commission in the UK have seen with some of their local NGOs, or the impact of Black Lives Matter on US charities, or some of the decolonization discussions happening around the world, that we are no longer in a place where we're going to assume that the old rules apply, where people like me are in charge all the time and look like me are in charge all the time. And so I think this is another extraordinarily incredible trend, and it has all sorts of these ramifications. So yes, it's political at the top. It's about who's at the government table, who's at the leadership table, which is what Winnie who's an amazing leader, was writing about. But it also gets into even the more practical things that I actually like to focus on, like what data do we collect, and how do we develop the clinical trials, and who are we getting when we do these observations and human-centered observations? Are we really being conscious of not just gender balance, but have we thought about, different difficult to reach communities and how we're actually addressing them? So I think this is a very exciting field. I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what it means in the innovation community. The innovation community tends to still glamorize, the great things that white men around the world do, and a lot of the innovation community in the traditional sense is run by rich white men. So we're going to have a lot of work to do to change this. But I'm excited to and I'm spending a lot of my time trying to step back and help support people now in front of me who look very different than me, but also are brilliant and thinking about great ways to change the world. So I just think it's a great time for this. I think it's going to be painful, and I actually don't think it's going to, I'm having done a lot of civil rights work, it's not going to be straightforward. We're going to 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards all the time, but that's where we are.
And Steve, I have to admit, I have a huge interest in this, but I get it wrong a lot of the time because I don't know what it's like to walk in the moccasins of another person, but I do try, and I'll make mistakes as well. And I think that's the really interesting thing, which tees us up next for the final one. We covered moving to digital disruption when we talked about the DRC, but let's move to the surprisingly sexy middle. And this is where it's messy in the middle always. And you say adapting and scaling innovations for widespread impact. the complex middleware that has often been ignored as one of the less glamorous aspects of social change is becoming more and more important and surprisingly more sexy. I'd love if you took us through this as the final undercurrent.
Thanks, Aidan. And I'm biased on this one because this is in fact what I specifically teach at Stanford. But yeah, I think that we've seen a lot of new energy. I mean, look at what your show is about, innovation and new ideas. A lot of investments into early stage startups, into even social impact design and we are doing a lot of good work celebrating and investing in social entrepreneurs. I mean, there's always need for more, but and we've also done some sort of focusing on the last mile. What I focus on is the journey between that garage and the last mile. And that is a long and complicated journey. And the data is astounding how many great ideas that have proven efficacy or proven impact are not getting to the number or the people that need them. And that's because the middle of the value chain, this unsexy part that I talk about, that I'm trying to make more sexy, isn't very sexy. It's a lot of, but it's very practical stuff. It's, adapting, it's building a business model, it's going out and seeking investors, it's getting a regulatory approval, it's, building a marketing campaign, it's, going in the slog of day-to-day kind of business partnership management. And so we haven't focused on it very much. We don't invest into it very well. We see a lot of investments early and late stage and forget the middle and then wonder why we didn't make it. And we also so with that, the reality, the interesting thing is there's suddenly, not so suddenly, but in the last decade, there's now been a lot more conversation. I mean, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals alone are forcing more. If we're going to really make this stuff happen, which is going to be very hard, but how do we have to scale this stuff up, and we can't leave things in the lab or on the drawing table or just one or two pilots. So to do that, we're seeing a lot of donors and investors change their investment model to say, instead of just doing a few pilots, we're going to give big, but we want to see the whole thing solved in a way. And so we're seeing evidence and sort of a timing of all the investments that went into early stage stuff. Now we're hitting this next stage and people are saying, wait, we've got to fund that. We got to commit to it. So I'm excited to see that finally beginning to happen. And the reason I write about it as a trend is first, it is clearly a trend, but secondly, it's a space that a lot of practical activists can work. And it's a space that needs accountants, and it's a space that needs, program managers and project managers and marketers and people that are sort of sometimes struggling to find their role in all of this. And so I've written that as one of the critical places that we need to spend more time, that the next decade of practical activism should find more opportunity there. And actually, it will eventually be very powerful in changing the world if we can. And we've seen some things happen. I mean, and COVID is its own story, but how quickly, I hope we learn from some of the lessons we've created. Now we have to address the inequities that we've seen in the vaccines, but we've done this remarkable job of not only in getting the vaccines developed, but getting them up to where they're getting delivered. I mean, it's an amazing story, and obviously done in a time of acute emergency. But what can we learn about scaling and from that we can apply to things in the future?
I absolutely love the book, and I'm so happy to have a copy of the book up for grabs for anybody who signs up to the innovationshow.io newsletter, and you will be in a chance to win that book. Steve, I finished the show often with a quote that I love from the book. There were so many that I could have chosen from in your book, and I'm going to finish on that. But before I do, I just want to place this idea with you, that for you to finish today's show with your call for action from Steve directly. But before I go there, Steve, where can people find you?
It's Steve at stevebdavis.com is my email. I'm also can be contacted through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Stanford. And I actually have a website that's coming up. It's stevebdavis.com that will launch in the next month. But happy to learn more or talk to folks. And of course, my book is available on the usual suspects, all the major retailers.
I'm going to close from my side with this end quote that I love, and then I'll let you close today's show. I love this one, Steve, and there was so many I had to choose between them. The question I am asked more often than any other is how I remain optimistic in the face of so much suffering. The work itself provides my answer. In fact, despite some terrifying headlines, there has never been a better time, a time of greater health and prosperity in human history. The past 4 decades have proven that cooperation between government, business, and the social sector can shrink poverty rates that once looked intractable and eliminate diseases that seemed undefeatable. There is no reason we can't do the same with present-day ills, including climate change, biosecurity threats, and widening economic inequality. Absolutely love that, Steve, as a way to finish. What about you? What's your final message for our audience?
First of all, thanks for listening and engaging. And then second, I really hope that people find a pathway, if they're interested, to both optimism about the world. I'm not naive optimism, but practical optimism, but also practical activism, that you don't have to have a full-time job in the sector. You don't have to be, this brilliant social entrepreneur. You don't have to, be the champion volunteer mom. All of that's great. We have those people, but the world has always changed mainly by people taking small steps, working in small communities, working on small issues. And that's really important too. So I just encourage everybody to find that piece of themselves to where they can feel good about the difference they can make, and we can all make a difference. But thank you very much.
Author of Undercurrents, Channeling Outrage to Spark Practical Activism, Steve Davis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.